across the Potomac, across the Potomac, across the Potomac, we're the boys, across the Potomac, bully boys, hey, bully boys, oh, if you wanna have a good time, join the cavalry, join the cavalry, join the cavalry, if you wanna kiss the devil, if you wanna have fun, if you wanna smell hell, join the cavalry.
On June 25, 1863, Jeb Stuart, with 3,500 cavalrymen and a battery of artillery, left the vicinity of Salem. On the map now you'll see that spot designated as the Plains. Passed through the Bull Run Mountains, sidestepped the marching column of the Second Corps that was heading toward Leesburg to cross the Potomac at Edwards Ferry. Crossed the Orange and Alexandria Railroad at a spot near Brentsville. Passed to the south of Centerville, a Union stronghold. Crossed the Occoquan River at Wolf Run Shoals and turned north. Passed through Burke Station and Fairfax and reached the Potomac River at Seneca Ford in the evening of June 27, 1863. It's close to sunset, June 27th, 1863, and we've come down the road toward Seneca Ford at the Potomac, and we've crossed over onto this trace which will take us to Rosner's Ford late in the evening and through the night. On June 27th, Jeb Stuart crossed the Potomac with about 3,500, 4,000 cavalrymen, one battery of horse artillery, and no wagons. All the Union corps had been crossing the Potomac since the day before, and Lee with Longstreet's 3 divisions had crossed the Potomac the day earlier on June 25th. As you can see, this area of the river is clotted with a span of rocky islands. Now there's some confusion about the location of the ford that Stuart used. It seems clear from the record that this fording area was known as Seneca Ford from the Virginia side, and Rosner's Ford, Rocer's Ford from the Maryland side. Now, according to stories handed down from various sources of cavalrymen who were with Stuart on this march, the crossing occurring in late June, apparently the Potomac River was somewhat swollen, and so the actual direction of the crossing would have been at a diagonal from left to right that would have carried the line across the river some distance through the water, half a mile or so. In any event, it took all night for Stuart to get his force across the Potomac. Early in the morning, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., he had most of the force across, and they camped on the left bank of the Potomac. They disrupted the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. They captured several canal boats that were full of soldiers and civilians. They appear to have destroyed one of the locks, or at least severely damaged it so that it became inoperable. And then they left the area around 10 o'clock. Now, had Stuart been motivated to move rapidly north to make contact with Ewell, who was then at York, he had an easy, rapid way to accomplish that objective simply by taking Highway 112 directly north from the Seneca Ford Road through Darnesville to Westminster, then to the Mason-Dixon line. At that point, he would have to decide whether he was going to pass through Hanover, which was a large town, through the streets of Hanover, which is questionable, or go around it. But in any event, there's just no question that had he wanted to, had he been motivated to, had it been his objective, he would have easily been at the Mason-Dixon line by the evening of June 28, which means that he would have contacted Jubal early during the morning hours of June 29 and conform to what the historians tell us he was expected to do by General Lee. All right, this is the right bank of the Potomac. We're probably half a mile away from the county line between Loudoun County and Fairfax County. Now we're going to follow the route that Stuart took to get to Hanover. And as we do this, we're going to debunk the historical myth about Jeb Stuart's failure to keep General Lee apprised of the movements of the enemy army in the several days between the time that General Lee crossed the Potomac on the 25th until the time he engaged at Gettysburg on July 1. Now, the reason there is a myth is because both officers in their official reports put the situation as if they both were, that General Lee expected Stuart to move as rapidly as possible once he crossed the Potomac to connect with Ewell's corps, which meant connect to Early's division, which Stuart knew from his communications with Lee was going to be at York and would eventually be moving back west. York, Abbottstown, toward Arntsville, Shippensburg, the South Mountain. And just as obvious, the record shows that Jeb Stuart did not move rapidly to connect to Early. And that's the criticism that's been heaped upon him for 150 years. But what we do in these scouts is we're not so concerned about what the witnesses say as much as we're focusing on what they actually did. We measure their words by their actions, and in that way we learn what they were really doing. All right, we're on the left bank of the Potomac. It's about 6 a.m., June 28, 1863. Sometime later in the morning, the so-called spy Harrison is going to be moving away from Frederick and through the Middleton Valley to make his way to Chambersburg to report to General Lee that Hooker's army is concentrated around Frederick in front of South Mountain. The blast of the Union corps are across the Potomac, about 15 miles further north of us. This is the area where Jeb Stuart crossed the Potomac. Now, it wasn't easy crossing this river in the nighttime on the 27th. It was a little high from the rains that were further to the west and the north, so that the cavalrymen basically found themselves up to their saddles in water. And they had to drag the cannon and the carriages. The men had to carry the ammunition in their saddles. It took all night. On the opposite side of the river here, there's the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal with various locks, and Jeb and his men are going to spend time over there from about 3 a.m. to about 8 or 9 a.m. They're going to hang out over there. They're going to capture some traffic on the canal. They're going to try to destroy some of the locks. In other words, they're going to take time. So, in terms of our analysis, instead of immediately throwing his horses into a gallop and heading toward York, toward Pennsylvania, which is only about 30 miles away, he begins to take his time. And later in our scout, we'll try to come to some conclusions about why and how is it relevant to General Lee's campaign and his own design in terms of bringing the Union Army to a battle. Now, when Jeb's men got onto this side of the Potomac, they got to climb up that berm, which represents the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. And this is not, it's not that difficult to do. Now, when he got up here on this towpath, this is the lock that he had tried to damage by interfering with its mechanism, and he captured a few of these boats full of soldiers and civilians moving between Washington and going upriver toward Harper's Ferry. Now, the first decision that Stuart would have made is right here at this intersection. Now, if Jeb Stuart had no problem moving very, very quickly. All you got to do is go to the Chambersburg raid. But remember that he took 3,000 troops, 3,000 cavalrymen. He crossed the Potomac at McCoy's Ford. He went by a roundabout way and came into Chambersburg, went all the way around the Union Army after Antietam and recrossed the Potomac at White's Ford. He did that within about 36 hours. He traveled about 60 miles. Just no problem moving quickly when he needed to. He didn't stop anywhere. And so his first decision here, all he's got to do is take 112 through Darnesville. It will take him directly to Westminster and the Pennsylvania line and York. And he can get there by tonight, the night of June 28th. He can be at the Pennsylvania-Maryland line. The next morning, he'll be in contact, the morning of the 29th, he'll be in contact with Early. Easy. He doesn't do that. He sends one of his brigades up 112 to Darnesville, but that's just to protect his flank from Union forces that might appear from the west. He takes his other two brigades and he takes 190 about 6 miles down the road to Potomac, a crossroads. He turns north and he goes into Rockville. Totally out of his way if his only goal was to get to early. Of course, the popular image of Jeb Stuart is one of a young man, carefree, undisciplined, reckless, and in the case of the Gettysburg campaign, severely retarded in his failure to conform to the instructions of General Lee. And the historians over the 150 years since the battle occurred have adopted the arguments that were made by Stuart's critics after his death, that his failure to be in direct communication with General Lee was a primary factor in the Battle of Gettysburg occurring and it being lost. That historical image of Stuart is grossly inaccurate. It ignores the fact that this supposedly young man had spent over 6 years out on the Great Plains of the United States, stationed at several army posts, and he spent those years primarily out in the field. He acted as a quartermaster, so that he became very familiar with how to support a force in the field logistically, and he led expeditions for many weeks out away from these forts, pursuing bands of raiding Comanches and Cheyenne that came down from the north into Oklahoma and Texas. And in that process of chasing these Indians, pursuing these Indians, he learned a great deal about how to maintain a necessary space between pursued and pursuer. During these years, Stuart had several experiences in which he rode long distances. He rode 34 miles in 10 hours. Once when patrolling over 800 miles of the Oregon Trail beyond Fort Kearny, he encountered 300 Indians at a place called Solomon's Fork in northwest Kansas. The Indians, for the most part, fled. He and his regiment chased them, overcoming several Indians on foot. He shot one. He sabred another, and he was shot in the chest in return. At another point, leading a small party of wounded troopers, he covered 120 miles of trackless prairie to Fort Riley, Kansas. In 1860, on an expedition against the Comanche in Kansas, Stuart traveled 120 miles in 35 hours. And it's that education that he brought to his experience as cavalry commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. So Stuart had no intention of proceeding rapidly to the Mason-Dixon line, and that's evidenced by the fact that instead of proceeding toward Darnesville the morning of the 28th, he turned to the east and rode parallel to the Potomac 6-7 miles until he reached the crossroads of what's called a spot on the road called Potomac, and from there he turned to the northeast to pass through Rockville, where he encountered a 125 wagon train of supplies coming out from Washington and captured it. Once he had the wagon train in tow, this wagon train, by the way, had 600 mules, he removed. They were teams of 6 mules dragging each wagon, and he reduced that team to two mules, putting the excess mules in a remuda, a herd, in order to shorten the length of the line, but also to give him, fresh mules. So now he's got this herd of mules, he's got these wagons, he's got prisoners, he's got about 400. He's collecting prisoners along the way. He's destroying telegraph lines wherever he can find them. He is going to cross 2 rivers, the Patuxent and the Patapsco. And apparently he destroys these bridges, these rivers cross the roads that he's on, and he's moving through a place called Brooksville and later Cooksville, and in between these 2 places, by the evening of June the 28th, instead of being at the Mason-Dixon line, he goes into camp along the road. It's Highway 97. And certainly, as he would have had on the Great Plains, which was the Comanche trick, the Comanches would have scouts that would be 10, 15 miles out from the main body, from the war party, the raiding party. And these scouts would have relays between the main body and their perimeter, bringing to the main body word at all times of where their pursuers were. So the main body would be able to change direction as the reports came in of the location of the pursuers. And it's exactly that framework that Stuart was using in keeping track of the oncoming enemy forces, because the whole point of this is that he knows that the purpose of sending Jubal Early to York is to induce the enemy commander to disperse his forces toward the northeast to counter that movement, which means that during the 28th and the 29th, Stuart is watching for the appearance of infantry columns marching in his direction, as well as cavalry. And he had no doubt had scouts 15 miles to the west of his line of march with relays in between, bringing him word of what was happening. And as we'll see, a great deal began to happen. All right, reached the Panspusko River at Hood's Mill. On the north bank of this little stream is the line of the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad. We're at a location called Hood's Mill. Stuart reached this river sometime in the early morning hours of June 29. You recall that he camped in that stretch of road on 97 between Brookville and Cooksville. So it seems obvious from the evidence that Stuart's objectively intended to not reach Westminster on the evening of the 28th. He consciously chose an out-of-the-way, a roundabout location in which to camp for that evening. This tells us that he planned on hanging out, hovering in the Union rear for at least 2 nights, 2 days. Which again tells us that he had no intention of rushing off to Early. His objective was to disrupt the Union communications between Washington and their base of supply, which at that time was at Frederick. Now, during this day, while he's performing these activities, Meade has relieved Hooker, and in reaction to General Lee's troop movements, swinging Lee's division, Ewell's Corps out toward Harrisburg, and part of Ewell's Corps to York and to Wrightsville. In reaction to that, Meade begins to break down the concentrated location of all of his corps and spread them out, disperse them across a wide front extending from Emmitsburg to Manchester. And so these corps are marching toward at least 2 of them, the 2nd Corps, 3 of them, the 6th Corps and the 5th Corps are marching in a fan like, in the ribs of a fan, marching toward Westminster and Manchester. Meade has now decided to make Winchester, which is exactly where Stuart is heading for, his new base of supply. And he's also sending cavalry brigades in the same direction. So while Stuart is waiting, delaying, he's definitely got scouts out to the west watching the approach of these various Union forces. Now he's going to spend some time here at Hood's Mill destroying the tracks of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and he's also going to go further east to Sykesville, where there's a bridge. That's the direction heading toward Frederick on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. All right, this is Sykesville. We're going to go down and look at the Baltimore and Ohio tracks and see if there's any bridges down here that Jeff could destroy. Well, here's the river again. And these are the tracks. This is the station. But I see no bridge to destroy. So it must be somewhere along the length. Well, here we can see where the bridges that Stuart was interested in are located. Along the line of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad between Hood's Mill and Sykesville, you can see that the river takes a small bend, which necessitated the installation of 2 bridges across each side of the bend over which the railroad tracks passed. So it's likely that when we speak about Stuart destroying railroad bridges, we're probably talking about the 2 small bridges that exist at this location that I show by the red. All right, we've reached Westminster. When Stuart came into town up this street, there were a few troopers, Union troopers. There was a skirmish. Several people were killed. The Union troopers scurried toward the east. There's also a small contingent of Union infantry manning a little fort. They were run out of town. It's unclear where these particular Union people went because they didn't give any warning to the oncoming Union corps. The story goes that Stuart hung out, spent the night here on this street somewhere. Very early in the morning, say 2 a.m., he went up the road to a place called Union Mills, which is on Pipe Creek, and he remained there for a number of hours. We might as well go on up to Pipe Creek, Union Mills, and I can finish explaining what was happening here. Now, for you to get it, for you to understand, you have to accept the fact that General Lee was lying when he said in his report that the reason he went to Gettysburg was because he was just befuddled. He was blind without Stuart, and the spy brought the news about the Union corps at South Mountain, and so he went to Gettysburg to keep the Union corps on the east side of the mountain. That's why he did it. He figured, well, if he went on the east side, they'd stay on the east side. That's his story. And it's really nonsense. And once you accept that, then everything will fit into place. You'll understand how Stuart's actions complemented General Lee's movements. It's more than just the destruction that Jeb caused on his march from the Potomac. It's the fact that he was doing the destruction. It was a signal to the powers that be in Washington that General Lee really did intend to sweep down from the vicinity of York and Hanover and move on either Baltimore or Washington. So that all the destruction that occurred with the bridges and the railroads and so forth, all of that really did interfere with the idea of reinforcements and supplies coming directly from Washington to Meade's new base of supply, which he was establishing here at Westminster. And it was obvious before the campaign even began, from the point of view of General Lee and Stuart, that this would be the Union base of supply in reaction to what Lee was doing. Now let me show you what we've done, where we've come from, and where we're going. We started out last night at sunset, the 27th, crossing the Potomac down here. And this morning, we moved out. And instead of going straight up this road to Westminster, Stuart went this way. Crossed the two little streams. Some of his men went to Hood's Mill, other of his men went to Sykesville. And they're destroying the bridges on the roads, not the railroad, the roads. And they destroyed the railroad in between the two road bridges. And then they continued on. This is the 5th Corps and the 6th Corps, and the 2nd Corps is behind here somewhere. And Kilpatrick is out in front. He's going through Taneytown. He's going to Littlestown. So by the evening of the 29th, Kilpatrick is here. Gregg is back here, and these two corps, this corps is going toward Littletown, this corps is going toward Manchester. So by the evening of the 29th, Stuart reaches Westminster, and then he moves out during the night so that by the morning he's basically here where we're standing now at Pipe Creek. To give you another pictorial, something that would be a little bit more of an illustration for you. You can see how it works. See, all this force is coming, it's right behind him. He's basically just keeping himself in front of that force. And he's going to let that cavalry over here Kilpatrick's cavalry get in front of him, because instead of trying to meet the enemy cavalry in a position where he's between that cavalry and Early, what he's going to do is he's going to attack the rear guard of that cavalry, forcing that cavalry to stop moving north and turn around and confront him. And this is going to happen in the outskirts of Hanover around noontime, around 11 a.m. on the 30th. At the same time that that's happening, as I showed you in the approaches to Gettysburg tape, Jubal Early's division is marching from York across the front of Kilpatrick's cavalry, passing through Abbottstown on his way toward South Mountain. And it's along the line of the march that Early gets another message from Lee that tells him that to go to Heidelberg, where he's going to meet Ewell coming down from the vicinity of Carlisle. Now, you can say it's ironic, but we're right on Pipe Creek. This is Pipe Creek. I mean, this is the line. This is the line that Meade intended to. That's why he's moving his troops. He's moving his troops into position along this creek. Now, of course, the creek itself is not a formidable obstacle in a physical sense. I mean, you can jump off that bank over there, and in 3 or 4 strides, you're going to be over on this sandy beach. But it's a barrier, it's a ditch. And the line that Meade intends to establish is going to extend from Manchester, which is further to the east of us, all the way back to Emmitsburg, which is a distance of about 25 miles. So Lee's maneuvering, his throwing out of Ewell's corps, the 2 divisions of Ewell's corps, and the key to it is sending Early to York, and then having Stuart hover on the very base, destroying everything that he can destroy: telegraph lines, railroad lines, bridges, canal boats, causing as much havoc as he can in terms of communication between Washington and Meade. All of that is a common, unified plan of General Lee. And the reason the historians have manufactured this contrary myth, in the beginning you can't blame them, because they're basically relying on the reports, the official reports that Lee and Stuart filed. But these reports were for the public. These reports are like military in every war, whether it's Iraq and George Bush, or Vietnam and Westmoreland, or you can go back through American history and our military commanders, and if you think that they told us the truth, then you're a naive individual. Now this is a view of the Pigeon Hills, and on the Google map you can see the black outline that I've created to show where these hills are. The red line from York is Early's line of march past Abbottstown. The blue line is the head of Kilpatrick's cavalry column moving through the Pigeon Hills about 10 a.m. on June the 30th, with its tail, rear guard, still passing through the streets of Hanover. At which point the rear guard gets attacked by Stuart's cavalry. And Kilpatrick, who is at the head of his column, turns it around and it concentrates in the streets of Hanover, and it skirmishes all day with Stuart. Meanwhile, Early marches unimpeded westward, connects with Ewell the evening of the 30th at Heilersburg, while Stuart is moved off to the northeast around toward Dover and Dillsburg with Kilpatrick basically totally out of the picture. Behind Stuart, moving in a northeasterly direction toward Manchester, is Gregg's division. So the result of General Lee's strategic design is that General Meade committed 3 of his 7 corps, the 2nd Corps, the 5th Corps, and the 6th Corps, to cover the position of York, along with 2 of his 3 cavalry divisions, Gregg's and Kilpatrick's, leaving only Buford near Gettysburg. And Stuart contributed substantially to inducing Meade to make that commitment by hovering in the Union rear. Why else would the rebel enemy waste its time destroying railroads, bridges, and telegraph lines, and remain in such a dangerous position in proximity to the approaching Union infantry if the enemy was not planning on coming down hard from the north east toward Washington? So Stuart's presence in the Union rear for 48 hours enhanced the credibility of a movement by the enemy toward Baltimore and Washington. Now, you can cling to the romantic view of Jeb Stuart that the historians and Civil War writers have created for you, as reflected in these images. But take a look at a real picture of Jeb Stuart and the features of his face, and perhaps you'll recognize that this was a hard individual, that this frivolous, feminine behavior that he's portrayed as exhibiting is really just a mask for a very serious military scientist who functioned on the same page as General Lee. He and Stonewall Jackson were as close a soulmate as General Lee was able to find in the early years of this war. And the 3 of them operating together account for the great success that the Army of Northern Virginia had up to Gettysburg.
Tis old Stonewall the rebel that leans on that sword, and while we are mounting praise low to the Lord, now each cavalier that loves honor and right, let him follow the feather of Stuart tonight. Come tighten your girth and slacken your rein, come buckle your blanket and holster again, try the click of your trigger and balance your blade, for he must ride sure that goes riding